Welcome to Life Stories, where the truth can change everything. Today's story follows Jasmine, a woman who, after receiving a letter about her father's passing, uncovers a web of lies, betrayal, and corruption. With the help of unexpected allies, she embarks on a dangerous journey to expose a powerful man, Winston Hicks, who destroyed her family. As secrets unfold, Jasmine must decide if she's ready to take down an empire built on lies. Subscribe to Life Stories and join us to begin today's story of courage, redemption, and the fight for justice. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, crisp and official looking, with a law firm's letterhead that made my stomach drop the moment I saw it. It wasn't just the weight of the envelope that unnerved me, it was the anticipation of what might be inside. I had spent years building a life where my father's absence couldn't touch me, where I could move on, unburdened by the past. But there it was, his ghost delivered by priority mail. My name is Jasmine, and I haven't seen my father since I was 8 years old. 21 years of birthdays, graduations, weddings, and all the life-changing moments that one would expect a father to be present for, none of them ever touched by his presence. He had vanished from our lives so completely, I had almost convinced myself that he was a mere shadow of my memories, someone whose existence had no more impact than a distant echo. And yet, there it was, this letter. The very thing I had been running from, the very thing I had tried to forget for years, now returned to me, demanding my attention. "Jas, you're shaking." Sophia's voice pulled me back to reality. My best friend was standing across the kitchen counter, watching me with concern. Her eyes always seemed to read me perfectly, as if she could feel the waves of turmoil I tried so hard to suppress. I forced a smile, a hollow one that probably didn't fool either of us. "I should be fine," I said, my voice betraying my emotions. "I haven't heard from him in 21 years. What difference does it make now?" I tore the envelope open, my fingers trembling. Despite my attempts to stay composed, the words inside blurred together at first. My heart was beating far too fast, and my thoughts felt scattered, as if my mind refused to process the reality of what was unfolding in front of me. But then, the words came into focus, and everything else faded away. "Dear M. Rose, we regret to inform you of the passing of your father, Michael Cox. He's dead," I whispered, more to myself than to Sophia. It felt like an uttering that could never fully grasp the depth of the situation. The letter went on, mentioning something about a will reading and potential inheritance. But I couldn't hear any of it. The only thing that mattered was that my father, who had disappeared without a trace, without a word, without a care, was gone. Sophia moved around the counter to stand beside me, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm that was building inside me. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to say that everything was fine, that I was perfectly fine. But I couldn't. "Ha!" I chuckled bitterly, my voice hollow. "I should be. Right. He's been dead to me for years anyway." The words left my mouth like venom, yet they didn't bring the satisfaction I thought they would. It felt more like the emptiness of a wound that could never quite heal. Just as I was trying to breathe again, my phone buzzed. It was my mother calling. "Baby, did you get the letter?" she asked, her voice tight with concern, as though she already knew the answer. "Yeah," I replied, my voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "Just now. I saw it in the obituary section yesterday," my mom continued, her words rushed. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you." The world seemed to stop, and for a moment, all I could do was sit there, staring at the letter in my hands, unable to believe what I was hearing. "They're having a will reading," I said softly, my mind still trying to catch up with the reality of the situation. "They want me there. You should go," Mom replied, her voice quiet, filled with a mix of caution and concern. "But I don't know if you can handle it. It's been a long time." Jas, Aliyah, who had been silently watching the entire exchange, stepped forward. If nothing else, go to look them in the eye, she said firmly. His family. The one he chose over us. The other family. The replacement family. The thought of meeting them, the wife. The children. The family that had replaced me made my stomach churn. They would be there. Just as they had always been. Just as my father had wanted. A family that I was no longer a part of. I scanned the letter again. The words jumping out at me as my eyes flicked from line to line. The reading is on Friday, I muttered. More to myself than anyone else. At the offices of Harrison and Walker Associates. I'll go with you. Alia offered immediately, her voice filled with support. But I shook my head. No, I said. The word heavy on my lips. This is something I need to do alone. The next few days passed in a haze. The weight of the letter pressing down on me with every passing hour. Friday came far too quickly, and I found myself staring at my reflection in the mirror, trying to muster some semblance of strength. I chose a charcoal grey pantsuit, its sharp lines making me feel armored against the emotions I could feel bubbling to the surface. The law office was located in a gleaming downtown building, all glass and steel. Far removed from the life I had tried to build in his absence. I stood in the elevator, staring at my reflection. A woman who looked far more confident than she felt. As though the clothes might somehow disguise the turmoil inside me. As I stepped into the conference room, I found myself face to face with two strangers, Calvin and Olivia. My half-siblings. They had his eyes. Our eyes. Calvin's gaze was cold and assessing. While Olivia, at least, attempted a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Bruce, the lawyer, stood at the head of the table, a distinguished older man with a polite smile. Rose, he greeted, extending his hand. Please, have a seat. I sat down, my stomach tight, my hands shaking. Bruce wasted no time and began the reading of my father's will. Detailing everything, his properties, his investments, his artwork, his millions of dollars in assets. And then came the distribution. To my children, Calvin and Olivia. I leave the entirety of my estate to be divided equally between you. The words hit me like a physical blow. Nothing. Not even a mention of my name. I felt a rush of heat flood my chest. My father had erased me completely from his life. There must be some mistake. I heard myself say. But my voice sounded foreign. Distant. This isn't right. I'm afraid not. Bruce said gently. His voice sympathetic. The will is quite clear. Calvin let out a small, satisfied sound. Did you really expect anything else? He asked. His voice dripping with contempt. I stood up abruptly. My chair scraping against the floor. 21 years of nothing. And he couldn't even acknowledge me in his will. I demanded. My voice rising. I turned to Olivia and Calvin. My eyes burning with fury. No. I didn't come here for money. I said. My words sharp. I came here for answers. And I'm going to get them. With that, I walked out of that conference room with my head held high. Though my hands were shaking. When I reached my car, I finally let the tears fall, not of sadness, but of rage. My father had one last chance to make things right. And he had chosen to erase me completely. Sophia's text lit up my phone, asking how it had gone. I wiped my eyes and typed back. Time to dig up some family secrets. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. The drive home felt like a blur. My hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I didn't want to feel the rawness of what had just happened. But the truth of my father's betrayal kept playing in my mind. Over and over again. I had spent 21 years believing that I had moved on. That his absence didn't matter. Yet. The sting of his rejection was fresh, an open wound that refused to heal. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my phone buzzed again. It was my mom. I'm home. I said before she could ask. I had no energy to pretend everything was okay. She could hear it in my voice, the crack that betrayed all the things I didn't want to admit. "I'm so sorry, baby," she said, her voice trembling. "I knew he wouldn't acknowledge you. But that doesn't make it easier. You're stronger than this. You know." I didn't respond right away. I just sat there in the car, the weight of her words settling around me. "It's not about the money, Mom," I finally said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's about being erased. After everything, he chose them. The other family. He couldn't even say my name." I felt my throat tighten. But I didn't want to cry. Not now. Not when I had already given so much to this man who had given so little in return. "I'll be right in," I said, hanging up the phone before she could say more. The house was quiet when I walked in. The familiar smell of the coffee my mom always brewed in the mornings filling the air. She was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by dusty boxes I hadn't seen in years. The sight of them made my throat tighten. I knew what was coming. "Mom, you don't need to go through all that," I protested softly. But she ignored me, pulling out a thick leather-bound photo album. "I kept everything," she said softly, her fingers brushing the pages. "Every photo, every letter, every scrap of paper that proved he once loved us." Her voice faltered with the weight of those words. But she didn't stop. She kept turning the pages, showing me snapshots of the life we once had. My heart sank as I stared at the photos. There he was, smiling down at me, holding me as a newborn. A father's love captured in every frame. It wasn't the father I knew later, the man who disappeared, but the man who had once been my whole world. The photos told a story of a man who had loved his family but had ultimately chosen ambition over love. "Mom, why did he leave us?" I whispered, my voice cracking with emotion. The photo in my hands was of him, holding me on his shoulders at the zoo, laughing as I pointed at the animals. We had been so happy. But what happened to that man? My mom stopped turning the pages, her hand lingering on one particular photo. It was of my father at a corporate event, standing next to an older man in a suit. I recognized him immediately. "Winston Hicks." "Who's that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "That's Winston Hicks," Mom said, her eyes hardening. "Your father's step-sibling's grandfather. He offered your father a job at his company around the time everything fell apart. That's when it all changed. Jas. That's when your father chose ambition over us." I grabbed the photo, studying it closer. The same Winston Hicks who was now the CEO of Hicks International. The man who had torn our family apart for his own gain. He promised him the world, my mom continued bitterly. And all it cost was his first family. All it cost was us. The anger inside me burned hot. A fire I couldn't control. My father had chosen to abandon us for his career, for the promise of success. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. How could he have done this to us? Before I could respond, the doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I opened it, surprised to see Bruce Cox standing there. His expression was uneasy, as though he wasn't sure if he should be here. "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced, but there's something you should know," Bruce said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He looked at my mother, who was quickly trying to organize the scattered boxes. "Mrs. Rose, I remember you from the custody hearings. Why are you here?" I asked, my voice tight. I wasn't ready for more bad news. Bruce pulled out a manila envelope. "Your father. He tried to change his will 3 months ago," he said, his voice softer now, almost regretful. "He came to my office to amend it, to include you. But before we could finalize the changes, I could feel the weight of the moment press down on me, the breath catching in my chest. He tried to change his will." Bruce spread his hands helplessly. "Before he could sign it, he had a stroke. Very sudden. The new will was never executed." I stood there, staring at him, the weight of what he was saying settling over me. A man who had spent 21 years ignoring me, now trying to make things right. But it was too late. Bruce didn't leave right away. He handed me the envelope. And I opened it slowly. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. The truth about everything, the note read. Be careful who you trust. What's on it? I asked. My voice hoarse. I don't know. Bruce replied. Your father was very specific. He made me promise to give it to you if anything happened to him before the new will was executed. I stared at the drive, my mind spinning. What could possibly be on it? What had my father been hiding all these years? As Bruce left, I stood frozen in the middle of the room, clutching the envelope in my hands. The past was coming back at full speed. And this time, I wasn't running from it. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop later that night. It contained hundreds of files, emails, financial records, photos, and voice recordings from over the last 2 decades. But one folder stood out. Labeled Winston Hicks, Evidence. My hands shook as I opened it. My heart pounding in my chest. What is this? My mom asked, leaning over my shoulder. It was everything. Proof of fraud. Embezzlement. Corporate espionage. My father had been gathering evidence against Winston Hicks. And he had been preparing to expose it all. That's why he tried to change the will, my mom whispered. He knew Winston was coming for him. I nodded slowly, my anger growing with every document I uncovered. My father had been fighting to protect us from Winston all along. And now, it was up to me to finish what he started. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As I scrolled through the files on the USB drive, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The fraud. The corruption. The tangled web my father had become trapped in. It was all there. Laid out in cold, hard evidence. But with each file I opened, the questions multiplied. Why hadn't he gone to the authorities? Why had he kept fighting on his own for all these years? Rather than seeking help, the answers seemed just out of reach, lingering like a shadow in the background of my father's life. My mother, standing beside me, was silent as she read over my shoulder. I could see the sadness in her eyes. The same sadness I had felt all my life when I thought about my father's abandonment. But now, the sadness was mixed with something else, something like relief. As if all these years of unanswered questions were finally about to be resolved. Mom, I whispered, my voice trembling. He knew he was in danger. He was gathering this evidence for a reason. But he never told me. He never even told you. She didn't respond at first, just looking at the files in my hands. Then, her eyes met mine, her face pale. He was trying to protect us, she said quietly, almost to herself. He was trying to keep us safe from Winston. Winston Hicks. The name echoed in my mind like a bitter reminder of everything my father had lost, his family, his dignity, and his freedom. The man who had torn us apart was the very man my father had been trying to expose for years. And now that he was gone, I was left holding the pieces. The burden had been passed to me. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes as exhaustion threatened to overtake me. But there was no time to rest. The evidence was just the beginning. I needed to confront Winston, to expose everything he had done to my family. But how? I didn't have the connections or the resources my father had. I was just one person, facing an empire built on lies. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Olivia, my half-sister. The message was simple, but it made my blood run cold. We need to talk about Dad. Meet me at the coffee shop on 5th. I felt a mixture of dread and curiosity flood through me. What did she want? Was she an ally in this fight? Or was she just another piece in Winston's game? I didn't trust her, how could I? She had been part of the family that my father had chosen over us. She had been the family he had replaced us with. But still, there was a chance maybe she knew something that could help me. I told my mom I was going out. And before she could protest, I was already out the door. The drive to the coffee shop felt like it took hours, though it was only a short distance away. I had 1,000 questions running through my mind. But I didn't know if I was ready to face the answers. Was Olivia involved in all of this? Could she help me bring Winston down? When I arrived, I spotted Olivia sitting at a corner table, nervously fidgeting with a paper coffee cup. She didn't look like the confident, composed woman I had seen at the will reading. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice low. She looked around, as if making sure no one was listening. "I wasn't sure if you'd actually show up." I sat down across from her, my mind racing. "Let's skip the pleasantries. Olivia, why am I here?" She glanced around again before leaning in closer. "Calvin doesn't know I'm meeting you. Neither does grandfather. Winston." The name hit me like a punch to the gut, and I could feel my anger rising. "Winston," I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "The man who destroyed my family. What do you know about him?" Olivia shifted uncomfortably. "It's not that simple, Jasmine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad wasn't just protecting us from Winston. He was protecting you." "Protecting me?" I scoffed, incredulous. "By abandoning me? By erasing me from his life completely? How is that protecting me?" "Olivia." She flinched at my words. But she didn't back down. "I know it doesn't make sense," she said, her voice shaking. "But he was trying to keep you safe." She stopped suddenly, looking at her phone. The color drained from her face as she read a message. "We need to go," she said, her voice panicked. "Calvin knows I'm here. He's coming." Before I could protest, she grabbed her purse and rushed toward the door. I had no choice but to follow her, my mind racing. What was happening? Why was Calvin coming? Was this all part of the game? Or was Olivia finally ready to help me? We barely made it to her car when I heard the screech of tires behind us. I turned just in time to see Calvin's black SUV roaring down the street toward us. "Get down," Olivia shouted, slamming her foot on the gas as she swerved into traffic. "Calvin's coming for me. He's been tearing the house apart looking for something that Dad kept hidden." I grabbed the door handle, bracing myself as we veered through side streets, trying to lose him. My heart was pounding in my chest. What was going on? Why was Calvin so determined to stop me? Olivia's hands were shaking as she took a sharp turn, narrowly avoiding a crash. "I found it first," she said, her voice tense. "Dad's private journal. The one that's been missing. It has everything. Names, dates, transactions." My mind was spinning. Dad's journal? What could be in it? Why hadn't I known about it before? "We're losing him," Olivia said, her voice filled with relief as we finally managed to shake Calvin's SUV. She pulled into an abandoned warehouse parking lot, killing the engine. "This isn't over." "Not yet." I stared at her, disbelief mixed with a growing sense of determination. We had the evidence now. But what would we do with it? Would it be enough to bring down Winston? Olivia handed me a worn leather journal, and I held it in my hands like it was the key to everything. My father had left me this. His last gift. His last chance to protect me. I opened the journal, my fingers trembling. Inside was the truth. And with that truth, the war was just beginning. The journal felt heavy in my hands, its worn leather cover a stark contrast to the flood of emotions swirling within me. This was my father's final attempt to protect me, and now I held it in my grip. I could feel the weight of his love, his regrets, and his hopes for me and my mother. But beneath the surface, there was something else, a fire, a call to action, that was growing stronger with every passing moment. As Olivia and I sat in the dimly lit warehouse parking lot, the urgency of the situation hit me all at once. Calvin was coming. He was part of this family, a family I had never been part of, the one my father had walked away from. But now, I was caught in the middle of a war I never asked for. Yet, here I was, with a journal that held the answers to everything. What would I do with it? How could I bring this fight to Winston and Calvin? Olivia handed me the journal, her hands still trembling. She had told me that this was what my father had kept hidden, what he had been preparing to use against Winston Hicks, the man who had destroyed our family. The words on these pages could tear apart the empire Winston had so carefully built. But the truth was always dangerous. And now it was my turn to take the fight to them. I don't know what's in here, I said, my voice tight with a mixture of anger and uncertainty. But I'm not backing down. I can't. Olivia nodded, her face etched with guilt. He tried to protect you, Jasmine. I know it doesn't make sense. But he didn't want you caught in this mess. It wasn't just about the money. It was about keeping you safe. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that my father had a plan for me, that he hadn't abandoned me. But the years of silence weighed heavily on my heart. I didn't know how to reconcile the man who had left me with the man who had been trying to protect me. But now, I had to be the one to finish what he started. I had to bring Winston down. With the journal in hand, we drove to my apartment, the weight of the night's events pressing down on both of us. I barely said a word as Olivia navigated through the city streets. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. But it wasn't until we arrived back at my apartment that the full magnitude of what we had uncovered began to sink in. As I walked inside, I was met with the familiar smell of my mother's cooking and the quiet hum of the television in the background. It was surreal. How could life feel so normal when everything around me was crumbling? I couldn't answer that. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let Winston destroy any more lives. Mom, I called, my voice steady, though my insides were anything but. I need you to see this. My mother, who had been sitting at the kitchen table, looked up, her face filled with concern. She knew something had changed, she could see it in my eyes. But she had no idea just how much had shifted in me. Jasmine, what is it? She asked, her voice quiet, as though she already knew that this was a turning point. I walked over to her and handed her the journal, watching as she slowly opened it, her fingers trembling with the weight of what it represented. The pages were filled with meticulous notes, everything my father had uncovered. From evidence of corporate fraud to the shady deals Winston had orchestrated to destroy families. It was all there. The man who had torn our lives apart had been exposed. And now it was up to us to bring him down. Mom didn't say anything at first, just stared at the pages. But I could see the recognition in her eyes. She knew this was the truth, this was the answer we had both been waiting for. She was reading the same story I had seen of a father who had tried to fight back, who had been pushed into a corner, but never gave up. We need to take this to the authorities, I said, my voice firm. It's the only way to stop Winston once and for all. My mother looked up at me, her face filled with a mixture of fear and pride. But Jasmine, Winston has connections everywhere. He's not just going to let us walk away from this. I know, I said, swallowing hard. But we have to try. If we don't do something, no one else will. It was then that I heard a knock on the door. My heart raced. Who could it be? I hadn't expected anyone. And given the events of the past few days, I wasn't sure I could trust anyone outside of my family. I moved cautiously to the door and opened it, my pulse quickening when I saw Bruce standing there. Bruce, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. What are you doing here? I need to talk to you, he said, his voice low. I know you're planning something. Jasmine, you've uncovered the truth. But you need to be careful. Winston won't stop. And now that you have this, he motioned to the journal in my hand. You've become a target. His words sent a chill down my spine. I had no illusions about Winston's ruthlessness. But hearing it from Bruce, who had worked with my father, made it all feel much more real. We were in danger. But I couldn't turn back now. Not when the truth was in my hands. I'm not backing down, I said, my voice steady. This ends now. For Dad. For all of us. Bruce nodded, a small glimmer of approval in his eyes. Then you'll need all the help you can get. I've already contacted the authorities. But we need to move fast. Winston is dangerous. And he won't hesitate to destroy anyone who gets in his way. As Bruce left, I felt the weight of what was coming. This was no longer just about exposing Winston. It was about taking down an empire built on lies. It was about justice for my father, for my family, and for everyone who had been hurt by Winston's greed. I turned to Olivia, who was still standing by the door, her face pale. "We're in this together," I said, the words solidifying in my heart. Olivia nodded. "Together. We'll bring him down. But we have to be careful. He won't go down without a fight." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I knew what had to be done. And I was ready to do whatever it took. The weight of everything that had happened in the last few days pressed heavily on my shoulders. I had never imagined that one letter, one discovery, could alter the course of my life so dramatically. But here I was, standing at the precipice of something that could either free me or swallow me whole. The fight had shifted from a personal vendetta to something much bigger, much more dangerous. It was no longer just about exposing Winston Hicks. It was about bringing justice, reclaiming my father's legacy, and rebuilding what had been broken for so long. It was late into the night when the plan began to take shape. My phone buzzed incessantly with messages from Bruce, from Olivia, from my mom. Everyone was on edge. Everyone knew what was coming. But we couldn't turn back now. I had the evidence. I had the truth. And I would make sure it was enough to tear down Winston's empire. The following morning, I met with Bruce in his office. He was an ally, there was no doubt about that. He had been my father's lawyer. And he was now the only one I could trust. We huddled around a table, going over the journal, the USB drive, and the evidence we had uncovered. The documents were all damning proof of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and Winston's corrupt dealings. But we needed more. We needed to make sure that Winston couldn't wiggle his way out of this. I wasn't going to let him destroy any more lives. "I've contacted the authorities," Bruce said, his voice grim. "We'll have the FBI involved. But I need you to be careful. Jasmine. Winston won't go down without a fight. He has people everywhere, police, judges, regulators. You need to stay vigilant." I nodded, my stomach a pit of nerves. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I couldn't afford to be. For my father. For my family. For the truth. I would face whatever came next. As I walked out of Bruce's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving too quickly. The plan was set in motion. But the danger felt real now. The kind of danger that could cost us everything. I couldn't help but think of my mother. Her worried eyes whenever I left the house. Afraid that she would lose me too. The fear in her voice when she'd asked me not to go to the will reading, the fear that I might be walking into something I couldn't handle. But it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everything my father had worked for. Everything he had sacrificed to protect us. He hadn't given up. Even when it seemed like there was no hope. And now, it was my turn to finish what he had started. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and preparation. Olivia and I went through the journal together, cross-referencing the dates and names with the evidence we had uncovered. We discovered more about Winston's network, about the people who had helped him build his empire. And with every new piece of information, the web of lies grew tighter, and the stakes grew higher. It wasn't until Thursday evening that everything finally fell into place. We had the information we needed. The FBI had confirmed that they were moving forward with the case. And we had secured a court date for the following week. Winston and his associates would have no time to prepare. We were ready. But there was one last hurdle we had to face. Calvin. I hadn't heard from him since the coffee shop meeting. But I knew he was out there, still working for Winston. I didn't trust him, how could I? But there was something else I had to consider. Calvin was part of the family that my father had chosen to walk away from. I didn't know what to think of him. But I had to be sure. I needed to find out if he was with us or against us. I arranged to meet him in person. In a neutral location. A small park in the city, quiet. Deserted. Safe. When I arrived, I saw him sitting on a bench. Waiting. He looked smaller than I remembered. More vulnerable. The hard edge that I had seen in him at the will reading was gone. Replaced by something else. Guilt. Maybe. Regret. Calvin. I said. My voice firm but not unkind. We need to talk. He looked up at me. His eyes weary. I know what you're doing, he said quietly. And I know what Winston's done. I've seen it all. I've helped him. But I can't do it anymore. I raised an eyebrow. Unsure if I could trust him. What do you mean? Why now? Why didn't you stop him earlier? Calvin's gaze dropped to the ground. I was trapped. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting the family. Protecting my place in the company. But Winston, he doesn't care about family. He's using all of us. And I can't stand by and let him destroy everything your dad tried to build. His words were unexpected. And I wasn't sure how to process them. Could I really believe that Calvin had turned on Winston? Or was this some sort of trap? I'm going to help you, Calvin said. His voice low. I've already started gathering evidence, more than you know. If we move fast, we can stop Winston before he does any more damage. But you have to trust me. I studied him for a moment. My heart racing. Could I trust him? Could I trust anyone in this mess? But the truth was, I didn't have a choice. We needed all the help we could get. I'll trust you, I said. My voice steady. But if you're lying to me, I will make sure you regret it. Calvin nodded. A flicker of determination in his eyes. I'm not lying. I'm done with Winston. We have to take him down. We spent the next few hours going over everything, more evidence. More details about Winston's operations. Calvin had more information than I could have imagined. And together, we would bring it all to light. We would make sure Winston could never hurt anyone again. As I walked away from the meeting, my mind was racing. I had trusted Calvin. For now. But the battle wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally ready to fight for everything my father had worked so hard to protect. Tomorrow was another day, another step toward justice. And this time, we wouldn't stop until we had it. The courtroom was filled with tension as I stepped onto the witness stand. The journal in my hands heavy with the weight of the truth. Winston Hicks sat across from me. His confident smirk now replaced with a look of panic. We had exposed him. We had everything we needed, evidence, testimonies, and a promise that justice would prevail. As the judge declared Winston guilty, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It was finally over. The empire built on lies, manipulation, and betrayal had crumbled, and my father's legacy was restored. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. With Winston and his associates in handcuffs, we rebuilt our future. A new company focused on integrity and innovation. The fight had been long, but it was worth it. If this story moved you, subscribe to Life Stories to follow more tales of courage, redemption, and justice.